The stethoscope, once a cold instrument of clinical precision, now feels like a lead weight against the chest of a man who has spent 60 years defying the inevitable. In the quiet, frostbitten stillness of rural Michigan, Dr. Jan Pol stands amidst the steam of a cattle barn, but for the first time in 8 decades, the breath he watches is not just the animals. It is the fading rhythm of an era. The legendary healer, the man who stitched together the broken and breathed life into the dying, now faces a diagnosis that no surgery can fix and no stubbornness can outrun. As the snow drifts against the barn doors, sealing him in with the ghosts of a million saved lives, he is forced to confront the one question he never allowed himself to ask. When the man who saves everyone finally breaks, who is left to carry the light? This is not merely the end of a career. It is the shattering of an icon, a final, heavy confession from a soul that has given everything to the dirt and the blood. The world was not born in color for Jan Pol. It was born in the suffocating gray of a Dutch winter under the iron heel of occupation. We open on a landscape that feels less like a country and more like a wound. The Netherlands in the 1940s, where the wind doesn't just blow. It howls with the hunger of 1,000 hollow stomachs. In the small town of Wateren, the silence is heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, distant thud of artillery and the wet, squelching sound of wooden clogs in the relentless mud. A young Jan stands at the edge of a frozen field, his coat too thin for the biting air, watching a cow struggle in the mire. In this moment, the boy does not see an animal. He sees a mirror of his own precarious existence. To be alive in this time is to be in a constant state of near extinction, and the psychological weight of that vulnerability begins to calcify into something harder, something unbreakable. The cinematography of his memory is dim and flickering. He remembers the flickering candlelight in a basement as the shadows of soldiers passed overhead, the terror of the unknown, and the absolute, crushing helplessness of being small in a world gone mad with destruction. It was here, amidst the scent of damp earth and unwashed fear, that Jan's original wound was cauterized. He witnessed the visceral reality of birth and death occurring in the same breath, often in the dark corners of a barn where the scream of a birthing sow was the only honest vibration in a world built on political lies. For Jan, the animal kingdom became a sanctuary of truth. An animal did not hate, did not occupy, and did not betray. It simply fought to exist. This was not a career choice made in a guidance counselor's office. It was a desperate, psychological rebellion against the darkness of his youth. Every time he reached into the cold mud to help a creature stand, he was reaching back through time to pull his own family out of the ruins of war. He developed a frantic, lifelong compulsion to mend what was broken, a psychological armor against the fragility of life. If he could keep the heart beating in a dying calf, perhaps he could stop the world from ending again. The narrator observes the young man he became, stoic, driven by a quiet, fierce intensity. His hands already calloused by the labor of survival before he had even reached adulthood. He looks toward the horizon, toward the promise of a new world, carrying nothing but a stethoscope and a memory of hunger that no amount of success would ever truly satisfy. As the gangplank of the ship groans under the weight of his departure, the gray shores of Europe recede into a mist of ghosts and wood smoke. Jan stands at the railing, his eyes fixed on the vast, churning Atlantic, a man physically escaping the wreckage but mentally tethered to the soil that almost buried him. He believes he is sailing toward freedom, toward a life where death can be managed and pain can be cured with a steady hand. Yet, as the salt spray stings his face, a cold, intrusive thought flickers in the back of his mind like a dying ember. He leaves the ruins of Europe behind, but as the lights of the old world fade into the Black Sea, he carries a hidden, shivering fear. Can a man ever truly outrun the ghosts of a starving childhood? Or is he merely building a grand monument on top of a hollow, restless grave? The transition from the salt-sprayed decks of the Atlantic to the frost-cracked plains of Michigan is not a change of scenery, but a change of battlefields. We open on a landscape of brutal, monochromatic whites and deep, bruising blues, the Michigan winter of the 1970s. Here, the wind does not howl as it did in the Netherlands. It whispers a different kind of threat, one of isolation and the slow, freezing death of a dream. In the center of this frozen expanse, we see a lone truck, its headlights cutting through a blinding whiteout blizzard like two desperate eyes. Inside, Jan Pol sits behind the wheel, his face illuminated by the dim green glow of the dashboard, his breath a visible ghost in the unheated cab. He is no longer the starving boy of Waterin, but he has become something perhaps more haunted. The Iron Healer, a man who has traded his sleep, his warmth, and his very youth for the survival of a land that offers nothing but hardship in return. The cinematography lingers on the sensory details of his labor. The rhythmic clink of metal instruments against a metal tray, the steam rising from a cow's flank in a barn where the temperature is barely above freezing, and the deep, permanent grime etched into the creases of his knuckles. This is the era of the last hope. We witness the psychological weight of this title through the eyes of the farmers. Desperate men with weathered faces and trembling hands who watch Jan as if he were a deity capable of holding back the tide of bankruptcy. To these people, the life of a single animal is not a statistic. It is the mortgage, the tuition, the next meal. Jan carries this pressure in the set of his shoulders, a silent pact made with the dirt of the Great Lakes. He becomes a god of the farms, but the narrator observes the cost of such divinity. A profound, creeping loneliness. Even with Diane by his side, there is a part of Jan that remains in those midnight barns, a part of him that belongs only to the dying and the born. As the years bleed into decades, the script shifts its focus to the internal architecture of his identity. Jan Pol has built an empire of empathy, a practice that eventually draws the gaze of the world. But as the cameras arrive and the lights of global fame begin to shine, the psychological dissonance grows. He is celebrated for his tirelessness, yet the narrator reveals the secret fear of a man who has found his identity only in exhaustion. He has spent 60 years stitching the world back together, using his body as a dam against the flood of mortality. We see him in a rare quiet moment, standing in the surgery suite after the crew has left. The silence is deafening. He looks at his hands that have pulled life from the brink of the abyss, and realizes with a jolt of existential vertigo that while he was busy saving everyone else's time, his own was slipping through his fingers like dry grain in a leaky silo. The fame is a shroud, a glittering layer that masks the mounting fatigue of an octogenarian who doesn't know how to stop. He has become a caricature of strength, a mythic figure of the Midwest, but the man underneath is fraying. During a routine checkup on a local mare, the camera tightens into a claustrophobic close-up. The air in the barn is still, the only sound the heavy thrum of the horse's heart. As Jan reaches for his syringe, a sudden, sharp tremor ripples through his right hand, a violent rebellion of the nerves, forcing him to drop the instrument. In the shattered reflection of the stainless steel tray, he catches a glimpse of his own eyes, and for the first time in 83 years, he does not recognize the man staring back. The vibrant, chaotic symphony of Pol veterinary services, the frantic barking, the rhythmic chime of the entrance bell, the hurried footsteps of technicians, suddenly drops into a haunting, airless minor key. We move from the sun-drenched chaos of the waiting room into the suffocating, clinical intimacy of Dr. Pol's private office. Here, the air is stagnant, smelling of old paper and the sharp, metallic tang of disinfectant. The walls are a mosaic of a lifetime's achievements. Framed awards, degrees from a world that no longer exists, and photographs of a younger, invincible Jan standing over cattle like a conqueror. Now, in the dim afternoon light, these accolades no longer feel like trophies. They feel like tombstones, marking the years he traded for a legacy that is suddenly, violently, reaching its twilight. Jan sits behind his desk, his frame appearing smaller, more fragile against the high-backed leather chair. The news has been delivered, not in the heat of a barn, but in the sterile, unyielding silence of a specialist's report. The diagnosis is a betrayal. For 83 years, his body has been a finely tuned machine of mercy, a vessel of iron will that refused to break. Now, the narrator explores the visceral, psychological devastation of a titan being brought low by the very biology he spent a lifetime mastering. His internal monologue is a heavy, poetic lament. He feels the treachery in his own marrow, a slow-rolling rebellion of nerves and bone that signals the forced end of his hands-on reign. He has survived wars, blizzards, and the gore of 1,000 surgeries, but he cannot survive the relentless erosion of time. The conflict is no longer external. There is no sick calf to stitch, no wounded dog to soothe. There is only the war against his own mortality. He looks at his hands, those legendary, weathered tools, and sees them not as instruments of salvation, but as liabilities. The psychological pressure of the Iron Healer begins to crack. He realizes that the man the world sees is a mask he can no longer wear. The most agonizing weight, however, is the secret he now carries. He watches Diane through the frosted glass of his office door, her silhouette a constant, grounding presence for over half a century. How does a man who has always been the protector, the one with all the answers, find the words to tell his partner that the long day is finally reaching its sunset? How does he admit that the news is not good? He rises, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he is walking through deep water. Every step toward the door feels like a step toward an ending he isn't ready to sign. He finds his family gathered in the hallway, the warmth of their presence a sharp contrast to the cold stone in his chest. He draws a breath, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He opens his mouth to speak the truth, to let the mask fall and finally surrender to the inevitable. Just as the first word trembles on his lips, a frantic, thunderous knock at the clinic door shatters the silence, followed by a scream for help with a life-or-death emergency. Jan looks down at his shaking fingers, a paralyzing question hanging in the air. Can he trust his hands to save one last life, or will his first failure be his final act? The aftermath of the truth is not a storm. It is a heavy, rhythmic stillness. We open on the clinic at dawn, but the light feels different. Amber and thin, stretching across the linoleum floors like a long, tired sigh. The scent of transition is thick in the air, a mixture of floor wax and the cold, metallic tang of instruments that Jan Pol no longer holds. He stands in the observation gallery, his hands buried deep in his pockets to hide the faint, persistent ghost of a tremor. Below him, the clinic hums with a frantic energy that he once commanded, but now he is a ghost in his own house. He watches Charles and the veterinary staff move with a synchronized, youthful urgency, responding to the cries of the sick and the wounded. The narrator observes the profound psychological ache of a king without a throne, a titan who has been sidelined by the very nature he spent 8 decades trying to tame. It is the deep darkness of a man who has lost his function but kept his soul. The cinematography shifts into a poetic, internal meditation. Jan's eyes, once sharp and clinical, now soften into a reflective haze. He begins to see the world not as a series of problems to be fixed, but as a tapestry of endurance. In his mind's eye, he retraces the millions of miles he has driven, the thousands of midnight journeys through Michigan's frozen heart. He feels the phantom vibrations of 1,000,000 different heartbeats against his palms, the frantic thrum of a frightened kitten, the slow, tectonic pulse of a 1,000-pound bull. He realizes, with a terrifying beauty, that his legacy was never the surgeries themselves or the animals he saved from the brink. His true success was the spirit of resilience he sowed into the very soil of this community. He taught a generation that to care is to suffer, and to suffer is to be truly alive. The tragedy of his physical decline begins to transmute into a golden, inspirational testament. He is not breaking. He is merging with the land he served. We transition into a cinematic, slow-motion montage that serves as a visual elegy to a life lived in the dirt and the light. We see the Michigan landscape in its raw, indifferent majesty, the swaying stalks of dry corn, the rusted silos standing like sentinels against a bruised sky, and the deep, dark furrows of the earth that Jan Pol once walked. The narrator's voice is a low, gravelly whisper, noting that Jan isn't merely leaving the stage. He is becoming part of the atmosphere. He is in the breath of the cattle, the grit of the gravel roads, and the iron-willed stubbornness of every farmer who refuses to quit. He has transcended the role of a doctor to become a legend, a folk hero etched into the history of the Great Lakes. The psychological weight of his surrender finally lifts, replaced by a profound, quiet grace. He is finally at peace with the fact that he cannot save the world, because he has already given it everything he had. The final scene finds Jan in the mudroom of his farmhouse as the sun dips below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold. He moves with a newfound, heavy dignity. He reaches up and unhooks his stained, worn coveralls, the armor he has worn into battle for 60 years. He hangs them on a peg, the fabric retaining the shape of his weary frame. The room is silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that sounds like a fading heartbeat. He reaches for the light switch, his hand steady for one brief, miraculous second. As the room plunges into darkness, Jan pauses at the door, his hand on the frame. Out in the distance, far beyond the barn and the frozen fields, the sharp, unmistakable cry of a newborn calf pierces the night, a raw, primal sound of a new life beginning against all odds. He stands in the shadows, a faint smile touching his lips, leaving us to wonder. Does the healer's work ever truly end? Or is he merely passing the torch to a universe that refuses to stop breathing?